So welcome to the webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Advocacy in Action, Learnings for the ECD Sector. I'm joined today by Noncedo Madubedube and Mark Heywood, and we are very lucky to have both of them with us. The webinar is hosted by Ilifa Labantwana and NECDA, and we're very grateful for them for also putting this together. My name is Tess Peacock, and I'm your host for today. I'll be in conversation with our two panelists. I'm an associate of Ilifa Labantwana and a director of a new organization called the Equality Collective based in the rural Eastern Cape. I also sit on Equal Education's National Council as the treasurer, so I know Noncedo very well. And I worked with Mark back in my student days in trying to create a cadre of young lawyers committed to constitutionalism and social justice. So I hope today is a very relaxed and comfortable conversation with the two panelists here today. So Noncedo Madubedube, thank you so much for your time. Noncedo is the General Secretary of Equal Education, a community and membership-based organization advocating for quality and equality in South Africa's education system. Noncedo hopes that by mobilizing people directly affected by problems linked to education, that they can win victories to secure better futures for more learners. Noncedo is a trained teacher with majors in mathematics and language, and now leads one of the most significant social movements in South Africa today. And Mark Heywood. Mark is the editor of the Maverick Citizen, a section of the Daily Maverick. Mark worked for and then led the AIDS Law Project, later renamed SECTION27, a public interest law center promoting human rights. Mark also co-founded the Treatment Action Campaign, TAC, which built a significant movement campaigning for HIV treatment for all South Africans. TAC is widely considered one of the civil society organizations with some of the most significant human rights victories in our constitutional democracy. Mark has also been instrumental in advocacy around textbook provisioning in schools, as well as organizing the Zuma Must Fall campaign. So thank you to you both for joining us. Why are we here today? So 2020 was an unprecedented year for the ECD sector, and I'm just going to briefly summarize what happened in 2020, and then the main goal for today is really to have the opportunity for the ECD sector to learn from veterans in the education and health sectors as we grow our advocacy as a sector. So I'm going to start by just sharing my screen and do a very, very brief presentation. So 2020 was an unprecedented year for ECD. We started off, the year was hit by COVID-19 and that led up to a lockdown. That lockdown was impacted obviously the whole economy and the whole country, but particularly the ECD sector has always been a sector that was in a precarious position. And as largely being a sector that has private providers and small businesses, the sector was particularly hard hit by the closing of the economy. Later on in the year, the minister announced that she was going to direct 1.3 billion rand to hire compliance officers, and the sector thought, are you joking, basically? With a sector in an incredibly precarious position, the sector really felt that that money should be directed in continuity grants to flow directly to the ECD workforce. The Save Our ECD Workforce campaign was therefore launched, and you can see there a montage of pictures across the country of pickets in almost all the provinces where people the sector really mobilized and said that money needs to be directed to the sector directly. So they've managed to garner 12,719 signatories. There were over 350 pickets across 9 provinces. There were over 50 media appearances for the campaign, over 2,000 social media posts, and at the end of the day, 486 million rand was leveraged to benefit 108 ECD workers. So really the power of advocacy demonstrated in this campaign, but also it wasn't the mobilizing of practitioners alone. There was rigorous research that went into the campaign. Both NECDA and Ilifa Labantwana conducted surveys in the sector and managed to be able to evaluate what the needs of the sector was and how badly it was affected by COVID, as well as with the NIDS-CRAM survey revealing that the ECD sector was a sector hanging in the balance. And of course, lots of people were also engaging directly with government at the time. Then we had 2 court cases that were launched against the Department of Social Development. So once lockdown hit, the ECD sector had absolutely no idea when it could reopen. Once the Department of Basic Education was already communicating with the education sector about how schools could reopen, the ECD sector in comparison had no plans about when they could reopen. They were just told that they had to remain closed. And at that time, the lawyers scrutinized that call and said, we don't think that the department is actually empowered to keep ECD centers closed. And what happened was we had Solidarity together with SA Childcare as amicus took the Department of Social Development to court, saying you're not actually legally empowered to keep the sector closed. And there the court intervened, agreed with the applicants and said the sector can reopen immediately, subject to putting adequate health and safety standards in place. And then the second court judgment later on in the year was when the court stepped in again at the same applicants. It emerged National Department of Social Development had indicated that subsidies flowing to ECDs should continue to be paid across provinces, but it emerged that many ECD centers were not getting the subsidy. And again, the lawyers stepped in and the courts agreed that subsidies needed to be paid to ECD organizations, again, with immediate effect. And that showed an unprecedented public interest legal angle in the ECD advocacy that happened in 2020. Up until now, there hadn't been any court cases involving ECD outside of damages claims. So again, 2020 revealed this kind of new interest in using public interest litigation as a vehicle for holding DSD accountable. And then finally, we had the Real Reform for ECD campaign, and that was launched in August last year in response to a children's amendment bill that was considered very poorly drafted, but also didn't meet the challenges that people faced in relation to the current Children's Act, and in some ways made things worse. And so the sector came together, NECDA and Ilifa were founding members, amongst others, of the Real Reform for ECD campaign, which was then launched in response and to try and mobilize the sector to understand the challenges that the Children's Act faces to ensuring registration of ECD centers and that ECD centers can access the government subsidies, but also also embarked on a process of bill literacy and engaging in the parliamentary processes for the first time by the ECD sector. And the Real Reform for ECD campaign called for 5 reforms. So the first was a one-step registration process for ECD providers, together with the recognition of different types of ECD programs. The second was that all children who need it should access the government subsidy. The third was that we need simpler but adequate health, safety and program standards to be put in place. The fourth is that you need an enabling system of conditional registration and support for ECD providers to comply with registration requirements. And finally, for the infrastructure needs of the sector to be supported if we are to achieve universal access to ECD. And then just very briefly, the Real Reform for ECD campaign managed to get 1,270 submissions made to Parliament, with 90% of those submissions coming from practitioners. 7 provinces were represented, and over 150 organizations had signed on to the Real Reform for ECD campaign. So that's just a snapshot of what happened in 2020. You've seen unprecedented levels of advocacy in the ECD sector. And today we're taking a step back to say, okay, well, what can we learn from other sectors? What can we learn from the education sector? And what can we learn from the health sector as well? And, you know, as we look on the, you know, in reflection of the past year, there's also been people within the sector who've also felt in some senses uncomfortable with some of the advocacy that they've seen in the last year, having worked very traditionally with ECD and existing structures of engagement with the department. And many people feel uncomfortable with types of advocacy that involves protest, that involves picketing, for example. And so we can see there's been a spectrum of advocacy that's been engaged over the year, but I think lots of people in the sector still don't necessarily see or understand the value of this type of advocacy in ECD. So Mark, I'm going to pivot to you now. You know, you helped found the Treatment Action Campaign in 1998 in a very specific time and context. And I think what would help the ECD sector is for you to give a sense to us of what informed that decision. What did you feel at the time was necessary that you and Zaki Ahmed and others decided to found TAC? And why do you think having a spectrum of different types of advocacy in civil society is so important?
Thank you, Tess, and thank you, Noncedo, and thank you, everybody who's joined today. First of all, I just want to say, Tess, and your ECD campaign, congratulations for what you did last year, and for your advocacy and for your mobilization and for your successes, most important. It may be the beginning of a campaign, but I think that what you reported shows that advocacy does work in bringing about change and in bringing resources to issues that we have to remember, and this will be one of the themes of what I say today, is a right in the Constitution. And if a constitutional right is not being fulfilled, then we should stand up and demand it. And in fact, that is one of the kind of principles that underlies the Constitution, which is that protest is legitimate, that to speak out, to picket, to denounce, etc., in order to claim rights is part of the social contract of the new South Africa. And it is not something that people should be afraid of, and neither should people think, well, if we demonstrate, then the government will close their doors on us and will never listen to us. Government, we must always remember, are public servants. Politicians are public servants. They are there to help realize the equality and social justice that underlies our Constitution. But I'm sure we will come back to that in the course of the discussion. So, you know, to come to your specific question, and I think it is relevant to ECD, you know, in the middle of the 1990s, we could see that the HIV epidemic was taking a terrible grip over South Africa. Many people didn't see it because there was a lot of denialism, silence around HIV. So even though we knew that millions of people were being infected and many, many thousands of people were dying and becoming sick, there was a silence that smothered the response. It also smothered advocacy to begin with around HIV. But some of us who worked in this sector understood that one of the ways to break that silence would be ensuring access to treatment for people living with HIV, because if HIV became something less associated always with fear and death and so on, then it would be easier to mobilize it. So we decided that we had to start a treatment campaign. It's also important to note that before the decision to start a treatment campaign, just as with the ECD sector, I would imagine, there were NGOs working in the field of HIV. There was my organization, the AIDS Law Project. There was the National Association of People Living with HIV. There was the AIDS Consortium. You know, but if the truth be told, those organizations were not making headway. on the issue of treatment as a right, this most important issue. And I think what Zaki Ahmad particularly understood, and the comrades who were part of the beginning of the treatment action campaign, was that we had to build a movement. We would never solve these problems with a few middle-class people like me operating out of Wits University and a few lawyers and so on. You know, lawyers and NGO professionals can play an important role, but they can't bring about deep change. And HIV was deeply rooted into our communities. It was poor people that were at greatest risk of HIV infection. It was women that were at the highest risk of HIV infection, and it was poor people who were dying of AIDS. So we looked at the question of HIV as about power, and it was about how do you build power to enforce people's rights around access to healthcare services, people's constitutional rights. And this is where you get I think the overlap with what you're doing in the ECD sector, because as I started saying, very few people understood treatment. Very few people living with HIV understood treatment. Government wasn't prepared to, they said it was too expensive, and then they said it was poisonous. So you had to start patiently building a movement. You had to start with building what we call treatment literacy, so that people in the communities became their own advocates. It wasn't somebody far away as an advocate for a poor woman living with HIV. You had to give power to the people who needed that treatment. So that was the beginning of the process. And as you had said in relation to ECD, it wasn't just about treatment literacy, it was about research. It was about beginning to marshal resources to be able to support this campaign and defining what your objectives were. And that was, it was difficult. I have to tell you, you know, people look back on the treatment action campaign and sometimes they talk about it like it was ready-made, it was already cooked. It was very, very difficult in those first few years. We struggled to persuade people. We struggled to persuade ourselves. We encountered the very same type of things that you're talking about. You know, there were people in civil society who were saying, no, you can't do this. Don't rock the boat. Don't antagonize government, etc., etc. We had to work through all of those type of issues. So I hope that gives you, I hope that answers your question about what was going up through our heads when we started to try and build the treatment action campaign.
Absolutely, thanks, Mark. I think that's a good introduction, and I think there's a lot of, you know, around protests being legitimate, that there is a sense that government will shut down if you are picketing and protesting. And how do you exercise your democratic rights to public participation, to freedom of expression in a way that opens doors as well, and cultivating that culture that makes that these are not consequences to participating in democracy in this way. And I think that's a question we can come back to as well. Noncedo, you know, EE was founded in 2008. It started with 7 people at its first youth group. Its first engagements were around one school and fixing one school. And it has now emerged into an organization that has 5,000 equalizers, grade 10 to grade 12s, meeting across the country every week, which is really quite remarkable. I'm interested to know from you, what type of advocacy does Equal Education engage with? So what different types of advocacy, and why do you think that spectrum of different types of advocacy is important in Equal Education's work?
Thanks, Tess, and hello to everyone. It's great that so many people have joined us this afternoon. I'm in a precarious place because I'm sitting a couple of meters away from Michael Komape's home in Limpopo. And part of the reason we're here is because we want to sort of revitalize work around school infrastructure in the province. And a lot of people that have been following the story around school infrastructure will understand why that's prevalent, especially for this moment. But I'll slide that inside Tess's questions at some point during the conversation today. But Tess, before I answer your question, so in my presentation for today, I'd started off by writing that building social movement is an extreme sport. And when Mark says it isn't easy, I resonated deeply with that idea. And I want people to understand that, especially inside sort of the ECD sector, that the work is always towards sort of the long game, you know. And these ideas that Mark was putting on the table around patience, around building people's power, around taking each other along on that journey, around representation and who exactly is centered inside struggle, inside messaging, inside conversations. Those things are paramount, or like the practice of what you need to consider deeply and deliberately all the time if you want to build something sustained inside something like the Real Reform for ECD campaign, for example. And so so I just want to put that on the table, that this work is not easy. We're working towards ideals we probably never lived inside of in the future, and we want to be able to action those things as if we were sitting inside the emancipatory or the utopia that we dream of. And so we want to treat each other well inside these movements, inside this organization, while plotting what kind of advocacy is going to work in the immediate to meet the reforms that we're advocating towards. But to sort of unpack that, some of the strategies and advocacy tactics that equal education uses are multi-pronged. And part of the reason for that is because we've adapted and used and learned from models like the Treatment Action Campaign, from work being done in the past around education, basic and higher, by Black Sash, uprisings in the Val Triangle, the considerations around what's happened in Dimbaza in the Eastern Cape around the 70s and 80s, for example. And what we understood is that you need a multi-pronged approach to be able to bring everyone along on something that we understand as fundamental to protecting the Constitution and our human rights, especially for those marginalized in the country. So for basic education, through equal education, we're able to engage and involve our members in thinking quite deeply about the local school level issues and run comprehensive popular education around what are the different ways we can build sustained campaigns and mobilize the school community as a whole around the issues that we experience inside schools. So popular education is a critical one. Community and school community level education is an important one. You have to spend time doing this kind of work as well and invest real energy and resources towards it. The next is that we're able to then take those campaigns and talk to other young people that are interested in contributing to education and racial justice in our country, that work in different places. So we've got young researchers in equal education that form part of a research department. And we're able to say to those folk, look, this is what we know and understand about our circumstances. We know that it isn't right. And it doesn't sort of, doesn't depict these ideals captured in our Constitution, in the South African Schools Act around equal and quality and access to basic education. Can you help us along here? And the research teams are able to look at what policies and systems and protocols exist and help advise young people around where the channels are to push the lever or tip the scale around what equality, access, equity looks like, but also help us think about what are the reforms that we can achieve in the immediate. Are there gaps and channels and spaces for us to intervene? And through those sort of channels, through the research, we're able to engage different kinds of institutions. The one is the justice system. We're able to then talk to friends inside the Equal Education Law Center, for example, and go, look, this is fundamentally unlawful from what we understand from our research, and therefore we'd like you to help us do something about it through strategic litigation. It doesn't always have to end up in courts, but it's good to have movement and activist lawyers that understand the premise of why this is incorrect and unjust and help take you along a journey towards ensuring you can speak to power directly about how and when you'd like these issues resolved. The second is around using provincial and national legislative spaces. So going into parliament and informing new protocols, new policies, white paper, the works, and saying to parliamentarians, power, in inverted commas, that on the ground, inside of our schools, this is the reality of how this policy is being implemented. And these are the gaps we've identified because we've had support from these very young researchers. And this is what we're suggesting as an alternative or better way around implementation. And this is referencing some of the work we've done in the school infrastructure campaigns inside equal education for the last 8-9 years. So we're able to talk to the courts, we're able to talk to parliament through research, but now you must understand that not everyone can go into a courtroom, right, at a designated date or go into parliament. And so what are the different other ways that we could in the moment use to reach folk around advocacy? The others around media. So using traditional media. So we'll call a comrade Mark and say, look, these are the issues. This is the site of struggle. Is it possible to deploy a team and ensure that we center the voice of the learners inside of that particular circumstance? But we also live in a time where technology is accelerated and shifted a little bit of how sort of activism and social justice looks and operates. And so social media is a big platform for us to do this work as well. But there again, it's important to think about language. Who's speaking? You know, are there issues resonating with the people that are actually concerned with change or experiencing the injustice on a regular basis? So traditional and social media is an important advocacy tool, but when you activate and energize and build people's power, you need to also be accompany it with conversations around protecting the right to protest, for example, because that's the crux of what we understand democracy to have given us as young folk. And so you need to give space for people to be able to use their bodies, to go off into the streets and to go and confront power, to go mobilize other parts of their communities, to go, these are the issues that we're confronted with. These are the ways we're suggesting these could be resolved. And we'd like you to join us. We'd like you to take attention to these issues. And those can vary, right? But the thing supposed to speak to here, and I'm nearly done, I promise, is that once you're deliberate around popular education, you build a consciousness around the issues inside the people that you're dealing with. So the idea is that if we take to the street, someone's going to burn a bin, those things become secondary because you understand that everyone that's there understands that there's a long game here, and it's important that we get our issues across in a way that, I don't want to say doesn't antagonize, because I'm also ready for that on any given day, government, but rather doesn't destroy exactly the sort of principles that we work towards. And so taking to the streets, having active marshals that are going to assist communities and people on the streets to keep and stay safe, having a group of people that will engage police or law enforcement officers if they do approach and explain to them the praxis and the parameters of what we're trying to do is important. But those kinds of marches and occupations, having learners committing to, because we don't have food in our schools and there's a food insecurity crisis in the country, we're going to occupy the Limpopo Department of Education for 5 hours on said day. Those kinds of things give people the agency and the ownership around the issues and their campaigns. And for advocacy purposes, it's critical, because this work is for the long game, and it needs to outlive us and people like Mark, who will at different times lead these different formations and organizations. So you leave power with those folks, and they'll be able to sort of continue the struggle to where they need to find it, you know, because that also will shift and move, but it must speak to the people that are involved in that moment. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Noncedo. I think yeah, we'll segue more into I guess what advocacy can achieve, but I think you've highlighted one of the major things, which is the transfer of an empowerment of thousands and thousands of people across the country to be able to engage in the democratic processes and systems, as well as claim their rights in terms of the Constitution. Noncedo, I just have a very quick follow-on question for you, which is you studied to become a teacher at UWC. You joined Equal Education as a volunteer while being a student. I'm interested to know for you personally, what did it mean to join an education advocacy organization at a time where you clearly wanted to go into and become a teacher in the education system? And I'm asking that question in the context of what you think this could mean for ECD practitioners across the country to find a political home to exercise and improve the conditions of their sites of their ECD programs.
Yeah, so there's two things here. Is that sitting inside sort of university or high school, I realized that something needed to change. We had a very different experience of education in the country. And the ripple effect of what that feels like inside university is like frightening. And so we would go off to give back and tutor in different schools inside Kailicha, but we'd travel back to the university underneath the Table Mountain. And that sort of felt viscerally quite violent to us. And so we were interested in building this, like, I don't know, research hub to help us figure out what are the issues inside education. So when you're young, you think you're the first person to think about these issues, and therefore you're going to change them in the next sort of week or two. But we realized that there were many organizations inside of the education sector that have been working and grappling with these issues for a long time. But we also recognize that we've been falling forward to what we're actually trying to do if we think about the challenges to the sector being purely policy. And we listened to a conversation with Mary Metcalf where she spoke about this idea of being organized. And that needed to be something that goes beyond being inside a student formation like SASCO on a higher education university sort of level. And so joining Equal Education meant that I joined a group of young folk that were inside these schools and could viscerally experience and feel these issues every day and carry them forward. But it also meant that we were in discussions with young people, 16-year-olds who were identifying for themselves, at which point do you move a policy from white paper to the next? And when do you get an opportunity to publicly comment and share your own experiences in that schooling environment and for those issues? And the combination of being able to use policy, use the law, and be organized with peers, I think became something quite inspiring for one. And so then when you go teach inside a school environment, everything feels quite restrictive and traditional. And so it almost felt necessary for us to think about how do we use those that are most marginalized, like Mark was sharing, which are learners themselves, to continue and build their struggles for themselves and play the role of supporting young people in that role. And so I think for ECD practitioners in particular, as they go into the environment of sort of teaching and learning inside of the ECD sector, they need to also think about the things that become layered experiential factors in what that environment looks like. And then find others that are interested in those same questions to build momentum and activity and thought and organization with. I think it would be a really exciting thing to see the next layer of ECD practitioners that are going to be coming in, think about what the sector looks like in quite a conscious and political framing, and also just something that goes beyond, I don't know, the traditional nubs and tools that you need on a day-to-day. I'm going to see if I can make that make sense some more, but yeah.
Thanks, Noncedo. I just, for the audience today, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's something called Q&A. Please write any questions that you have on the Q&A. When you are writing a question, it would be helpful if you just put your name, where you're from, and who the question is directed to, if it's for one of the panelists or for either. If you could just indicate that, and then we will segue to audience questions, but feel free to start writing your questions as and when they arise through the process. And thanks, Ida, for sharing those thoughts as well. Mark, you've been involved in advocacy in so many different ways. So a treatment action campaign was a social movement. You've worked at SECTION27, which is that public interest law firm using law and litigation as a tool for social change. With the Zuma Must Fall process as well, that was again mass mobilization. Just looking back over your experience, I'm interested to know what you think can be achieved with the kinds of advocacy you've worked in your career thus far, and where you think it's instrumental as part of a process of progressive change.
If your cause is legitimate, and if your demands are realistic, then there should be no limit to what you can achieve with advocacy. What will hold you back is whether your strategies are effective or not in the campaigns that you are waging. And that may sound like a grand thing to say, but let me give you the example of HIV. When we started the campaign on HIV, not one single person was on HIV treatment. If you were a mother living with HIV, the probability of infecting your child was over 50%, and there were about 70,000 kids a year being born with HIV as a result. Government was totally against it. The medicines were too expensive because the private pharmaceutical companies, just like with COVID, were profiteering from the medicines. Everything in the environment was hostile to our campaign. But through building a campaign along the lines we've started to discuss, we were able to change all of that. And I think the model that HIV gives you is that it's one of these few issues in democratic South Africa where there is actually equality, more or less. At least there's equality that if you have HIV, you have access to treatment today. And 5 million people have access to treatment, where at one point, 0 people had access to treatment. Now, of course, the problem is that there's inequality everywhere else. And there's inequality in other aspects of the healthcare system. So we had to begin to address that as well. But there's no doubt that the advocacy changed the HIV landscape. And I think the same can be said on other campaigns. You know, Noncedo mentioned about being at Michael Kamapi's house. There would never have been justice for Michael Kamapi's mum and dad and brothers and sisters if it wasn't for advocacy. Michael Kamapi would have died and been forgotten. And not only was there justice for Michael Kamapi, but there was recognition of the struggle that Noncedo and others and EE are continuing around dignity of learners and around the importance of sanitation in schools. That came through advocacy and through campaigns. If it wasn't for advocacy and campaigns, you know, Zuma would not have fallen, frankly. You know, we may have a new set of challenges today, but the work of mobilization of Safe South Africa on the ground brought about that change. And that's why I say that change is important. But what I'm not saying is that it's the same exact method that applies in every situation. In every situation, whether it's ECD, whether it's basic education, whether it's HIV, whether it's a political issue like corruption, you have to take account of the specifics of your constituency in order to be successful in that fight. So, you know, if I look at what you're doing with ECD, it's not that dissimilar from HIV. You know, you, Tess, and you, Noncedo, and probably most of the people on this call know what you're talking about when you talk about ECD and why it's so important for children and why it's so important for children's development and education. But the truth is that the vast majority of parents in South Africa don't know what you're talking about at the moment, and they don't know it's a right. And you can't fight for something if you don't actually know what it's about to start with. So part of a campaign about ECD has to be going out, not just saying to people protest, but going out and saying to people, this is why early childhood development is so crucial for your child and your future and equality and so on in South Africa. Absolutely crucial, that first step. You know, it always strikes me, it's linked to the question of children, that children have a right to basic nutrition. You know, so, and this overlaps with ECD, because you don't learn well if you are malnourished and if you're hungry. And that, as Noncedo knows better than me, also applies to basic education as a whole. But nobody is using that right. It's an unqualified right to basic nutrition. But one of the reasons people are not using that right is because parents do not understand that what your child eats in that first 1,000 days from conception through to the 1,000 days is going to influence their intellectual and physical development for the whole of their life. So a campaign around child hunger and ECD in some ways also starts with a campaign around the right to basic nutrition for children. And these are all of the type of things that you use to build a foundation for the type of struggles that you are talking about with us today.
Thanks, Mark. I was actually doing an interview on SAFM not so long ago, and I just used the word ECD, I mean the acronym ECD, and the presenter stopped me and said, what does ECD mean? And I've got that feedback often, and I think we've got a lot of work to do as a sector, public facing, to explain what ECD is and why we call it early childhood development and not just creches and preschool, but also why it's so important in not only a child's development, growth, cognitive, brain development path as well, but also that it relates to our fundamental rights around nutrition, and so that we can exercise many other of our rights in the Constitution as we progress. You both have touched on a number of, I guess, what the ingredients are for strong civil society or for advocacy. I think, both of your work has involved different types of advocacy and overlapped as well. Noncedo, EE is a membership-based organization, so maybe you can just briefly describe what that means and why you think that is important for the types of advocacy that Equal Education has embarked on over the years. And EE's also got presence in 5 provinces, and how important do you think that is as well when building a social movement? And you can speak about what other ingredients you think are important. You've spoken about how you engage in different types of advocacy in the justice system, that you need researchers to engage in parliamentary processes. So you've touched on that a bit, but how do you, what are the inputs that you need as an organization almost to do and be successful in the work that you do?
Okay, sitting outside, I'm also fighting off insects, but all right. I think the fundamentals of building what I understand to be a social movement is a sort of a mass-based organization. So in essence, our agenda, our programs, our campaigns, our advocacy are all informed by the very people that sit inside the circumstances we're trying to change. And in Equal Education's case, those are learners. And what that carries with it, and this is part of the reason I said building a social movement is an extreme sport, is that these different people that come from very different backgrounds, but are mobilized by this one single idea, an objective, an ideal, come to the movement and to the organization looking for different things as well. And some of the things that are crucial in helping unify that voice and unifying the actions, the advocacy, the goal setting, and the strategy and tactics is putting in place a couple of things. For social movements, the one that is important is sort of this idea of how you're going to exercise democracy. How are you going to make sure that those that are most important to the cause and are centered have the opportunities to ensure that they inform the bigger picture and the long haul of what we're looking for. And so that's one. And the second is that you also need to create spaces for that democracy to thrive and flourish and reimagine itself and become reinformed. So we need to meet regularly inside leadership groups that come from these different school communities. These provincial offices and branches that we've got need to have provincial structures that help them think about regional issues rather, and regional stakeholders and connections and how they want to build power together. So people have a sense that, look, it isn't just my village with this kind of circumstance. Others, 30 kilometers away have the same circumstance, and we can work together to ensure that the things that we've never imagined could change can in fact change in our lifetimes. That's like an important galvanizing mechanism to keep connecting with others in the same boat. The other is that democracy also helps us, I don't have the right English word, but I want to say sort of enforce representation. It's easy for struggles to be co-opted by like populist sort of tendencies, even middle-class folk inside of our movements and in our organizations. And so democracy, it helps us ensure that the people that represent these issues are always at the forefront of them and are informing them at different times. The last is that we've got a constitution that helps govern the ways that we're going to exercise these democracies. We're going to impress representation at all times. And what the constitution does, it also helps us talk about how do we want to behave and treat each other inside of building this campaign. You know, are we going to put together codes of conduct or ideals that are going to match and mirror the thing that we are fighting for in the future? And that's been an important piece because it's sort of, aside from keeping everyone in check, it helps people feel that they themselves can be part of building small pieces of law and practices and culture inside of this thing that they're trying to sort of build campaign and reforms and structural overhauls about and with. So that the conversation about power is quite a massive one. And then just last off to answer your question, Tess, but I also saw a question that spoke about the differences between something like equal education and the ECD sector. And I think the point we were trying to make is that whilst you can't, I mean, there's no need, whilst you won't be mobilizing children under the age of like 7 or 8, you can use the space to talk to ECD practitioners about the fact that there's a sort of a structural reckoning around the circumstances ECD centers that are inside working class and rural communities face. And there's a socio-political sort of inequality there that we need to reckon with first, so that we can help people understand how to engage in things like the Real Reform Campaign, to understand why these things look the way they do, and to sort of create a sense of urgency around how these things could potentially change. And those are the things that truly sustain this idea of building sort of a people's power. But what that also does is that it puts in front of faces of people, other people in the sector like myself, because before this moment, the COVID moment, the 2020, having a C19 People's Coalition with an ECD, sort of a permanent ECD presence, hadn't thought about the connections we could potentially make on a daily basis with folk inside ECD as basic education. And so it helps you galvanize support from the sector, not just education, but also health, but also people working in sort of GBV and femicides. And we can collectively always build power together and support each other sort of moving forward. But also then most importantly, it will give you protections in whatever you advocate and ask for from general community members. And so this is the work that we do to try and continue to build a sort of like relevance and legitimacy, and not for government or to be able to sit on something like this, but for the people that are inside the school communities that we work inside of, because those are the people that need to take forward the struggle ultimately. And that we must constantly believe is possible. Yeah.
Thanks, Cedar. And I think I'll come back to the point now. There's a question in the group that will unpick some of what you've said that I'll come back to. Mark, I'm interested to know your input similarly on the question. I mean, Section 27, doesn't have a membership base, and particularly in the textbook provisioning, really effectively used the media as a change strategy. And so I'm interested to know what you think are the ingredients, and we've also worked in a social media context in the treatment action campaign, so maybe pulling on the different contexts and how we can affect change.
Well, I think it's about a kind of division of labor, if you like, within civil society. And it's about the type of change that we are trying to get to, and it's about our society. If we are to be successful in getting quality, well-resourced, sustainable early childhood development, then it is going to need millions of people in their communities to take that responsibility into their own hands at the end of the day. That is never going to be achieved by advocacy, by an NGO based in Braamfontein on its own. The NGO based in Braamfontein, be it Section 27 or whatever it may be, can really play an important role by providing lawyers, by providing research, for example, by using the law to advance a particular front of advocacy. But certainly in my experience, it is most effective when it is combined with movements on the ground. Where I've been involved in issues that have been purely about law, the change is not a deep change, and it can be taken away as quickly as it can be won. But it's also, it's about, as I said, our society. We want active citizenship from the moment a person is old enough to be active in trying to shape their own lives and their communities and their rights and so on and so on. So as Noncedo says, as we build these movements, we build them with urgency because we're often dealing with an immediate crisis, as we were with HIV. But we understand that social movements, I think, are really essential for the long term. They're really essential to democracy. to successful democracy, to successful constitutionalism. So those of us who work in this space have to understand that it's going to be long. You know, I didn't know when we set up the Treatment Action Campaign that I would still be around in the TAC 25 years later. It's been a good struggle, and it's been very rewarding, and it's been very educating, and so on. But it's about transformation. So I guess what I'm trying to say, Tess, is it's really important that we understand this division of labor. It's really important that we understand our roles. It's important we understand what media can do, what law can do, what social movement building on the ground can do, what research can do, and how all of these things can be put into a pot and can help to bring about the change that we seek and that we believe in. I don't know if that answers your question specifically enough, but that's my best effort.
I think it does, Mark. I mean, with the ECD sector, you know, I think there are organizations that do excellent work on the research side. I don't think there's enough lawyers, public interest lawyers dealing with ECD in ways. Equal Education Law Center has certainly started developing a practice in ECD, which is great. It would be great to see other public interest law organizations doing the same, because as you say, there's a multiple pronged process that needs to exist in this ecosystem to create a robust sector of active citizenry. And I think there are many areas where the ECD sector still requires strengthening. And I think we've started doing that work. So that's very helpful. Thank you. I want to...
Yes, I just want to say, and I'll be very brief on this though, but you know, if there's a gap in a strategy like there's not enough lawyers, then you ECD activists have got to find a way to fill that gap. That's part of advocacy. Part of advocacy may be going to the pro bono department of a private law firm and saying to them, nobody is working on this. Let us educate you about the situation around early childhood development so that you understand how important it is and why it's an important constitutional right. And will you work with us? Will you travel this journey with us? So really, you know, don't think of advocacy as just the toys that we have on the street. Advocacy means sometimes quietly reaching out and embrace it, bringing another constituency on board in your struggle so that you do have this diverse, broad front for the issue that you're dealing with.
Yes, and I just wanted to give a shout out also to Van Wyk attorneys who actually did that litigation last year. So there are other attorneys as well. But I take your point. We have to, part of advocacy is building the ecosystem of support that we think and know we need. So I'm going to start just pivoting to questions from the audience. There are two questions that I think are quite linked, and the one is this idea that some advocacy has like nefarious people backing it, for example. And there is this kind of conspiratory theory idea of the work that you're trying to achieve, and how do you grapple with those kinds of responses in the advocacy work we want to do. And I guess also linked to that is there's so many issues that one can take up. And when, for example, you've got the Real Reform for ECD campaign that's highlighted 5 issues, but there are many other people in the sector who think you should be doing this and think you should be doing that, and there's just so much to do. How do you respond, I guess, in a way that's meaningful and thoughtful? Because it might be that you should pivot and accommodate a different issue. But also, how do you also acknowledge that there are only, you know, a certain number of resources and you might be constrained in terms of what you can do. So that's a question for I guess, questions for you, Mark. And then for you, Noncedo, is how do you make sure, you spoke a lot about the need for building, having actual real membership in the work that you do, and real ownership, and co-creation, and actually that the movement and the equalizers guide EE's work fundamentally. So how do you remain authentic to that level of advocacy in the way that you are consultative and bottom up in a real way, and how do you do that in a way that isn't, that is accountable, I guess, because I think you can do a lot of advocacy that loses that accountability and that constituency base. And as Mark says, there's always going to be an inherent limitation to how you can achieve change as a result. So let's maybe start with you, Mark, and then Noncedo, you can come in.
I'll be brief. Look, there's always going to be people who say you have hidden agendas and so on. You have to trust to yourself. You have to trust to the integrity of your movement. You have to build your movement openly, make your agenda plain, and good people will believe you. That's all you can really do. It links to your question about, how do you conduct yourself, and Noncedo will answer this well. But your movement has to be what's the word? I'm not finding the word. Beyond reproach, in certain respects. But that doesn't mean that advocacy doesn't become antagonistic at times. It took TAC to have a civil disobedience campaign in 2003. And in 2003, the idea of a civil disobedience campaign was unheard of. Remember, that was not the era we're in now, where there's many protests and everybody is speaking out about the government and so on. In 2003, it was like you were traitors to dare to take to the streets and defy the government and so on. We had to push the boundaries. But we did so in a way always saying to government, if you do the right thing, we'll be your best supporters, we'll be your best advocates, not just what we talk, but what we do. And that is what TAC has shown, is that TAC has been crucial. Once we got past the stage, well, we'll never be past the stage of protest, but once we got past the stage of bitter protest, TAC has played a crucial role in helping government roll out the antiretroviral treatment program, just as you will play a crucial role in helping roll out and expand ECD, etc., when government comes to its senses about how important this issue is. So you can be antagonistic, you can be fierce, but if you are honest, you will keep the ear of government. That's what I would say on that. And the second question that you asked, where to start, I think that an ECD agenda is a huge agenda, just like a treatment agenda was a huge agenda. You have to strategically choose your battles. You have to look and say one struggle will lead to another struggle. So when we started TAC, we didn't immediately start. People with HIV needed treatment, adults needed treatment. But we didn't start with that. We started with something that we thought would resonate with people and be easily understood, which was preventing mother-to-child HIV transmission. Because that would help people to understand antiretrovirals, it would help people to understand AIDS, it would lay a foundation of understanding for a more complicated struggle later on. And so you have to think of this struggle as a set of steps. And if you can climb the first step and you're secure on the first step because you've won something, you're in a better position to climb the next step and climb the next step. And the other thing I would say about that is that victories are so important in giving people a sense of their own power. So if you are able to win tangible things, like I believe you did last year, then people say, hey, this works, this democracy does something for me. Okay, let's go for it. Let's go for the next thing. So it's difficult choices that you have to make. You have to have a democratic process within your organization, which I'm sure Noncedo will talk about, but you can't fight every front at the same time. You can't fight every single issue at the same time.
Sure. Okay. The one thing is that I I'm almost nervous to talk about movement here as something that needs like really robust provincial or regional structures, because there are many ways to organize ourselves, you know, and people at different times are helping us understand that things like provincial executive committees are things of the past, and there are different ways to merge and work together. But maybe we need a separate webinar to sort of unpack that. But I want people to know that when you speak to power, and I keep doing this in inverted commas just because I am trying to deliberately antagonize sort of the structures and institutions like government, folks understand that children are the future, right? So that's an eye roll, because there aren't enough protections being put in place or credence given to the issues that children bring to the table when arguing for the things that are most important to them, especially in the basic education sector. So that's understood. At the same time, people say, you know, support local economies. That's another eye roll, because we also understand there aren't protections enough put in place to support functions for like ECD practitioners, for example, inside townships and rural communities. So the structures and power overall understand the things that we're asking for, you know? And so galvanizing around things that you're going to have to sort of meet this idea of passive governance around those things will be provided. We understand these are the issues. Must be something that I think we just all understand and anticipate. And then for us to think about, whilst we're going to think of building movement and momentum and people's power around our issues and campaigns, that some of the lessons that we must learn from formations like UTAC, and I don't know if Mark, I've never had a conversation with you about this, but would agree, is that it's important to not try to grow too quickly, too soon. It's for you to layer and go deep inside the communities that you already exist in and see what works and what is challenging in those spaces before galvanizing every single part of the country. Becoming a household name doesn't mean all of those people need to become organized per se. And so the different things to think about inside the movement are that the entire narrative of what you're trying to do in the campaign, in the reform strategy, must be experiential. It must find and base itself inside how people interact with the sector on a day-to-day basis. If it becomes too political, too academic, it loses people inherently, and you have to sort of redo and restart that relationship and that conversation. Another is to be in regular conversation. So things like weekly meeting groups and youth groups for equal education are like paramount to keeping the legitimacy of our structures intact. So you have to find ways for people to meet, gather in regions, because it's also good for people to be able to find each other and build trust with one another inside the ecosystem. Mark mentioned different people in the pot to play different kinds of roles, but let's come together in those conversations often. And then the language of the structure intervention that we're trying to change. So the 5 demands, for example, for the real reforms are perfect, because they speak about the general access to a productive, safe, protected sector that is going to work towards ensuring that abantwana at a very young age are given the very best of what's necessary to help them flourish in future life. And then the things that become, I don't know, systematic in the everyday experience of operating in the sector can fall part of those 5 major key demands. And that's something that you can work through with people that are sitting on the ground in the most marginalized parts of the country to get a sense of what they feel viscerally. The other thing is then the language of those kind of those interventions needs to be translated into popular education material that allows for the conversations to take place with ease. So building stories and case studies has been a really useful way for us to share our stories, so that young people that sit in the northern parts of KwaZulu-Natal understand that while they have a scarlet transport crisis, there's a major issue around school safety and gangsterism in the Western Cape. And so when they think about what it takes to have a safe and conducive learning environment, they understand that it goes beyond their own sort of lived experience, and it builds a sense of solidarity that is so crucial to this idea of building sustained movement. And then inside of those case studies and those stories, to localize the approach. I can imagine that comrades at Funza and Nalibali would be super excited to help us build platforms on their own existing platforms that speak to stories of the ECD sector in particular. And so you find localized approaches. The story inside Mthatha is this and this and this. And someone in a northern part of Mpumalanga may be able to feel like they could resonate with that, because now the context is similar. But those stories need to sort of look like and feel like the people that are most affected by them. And then these channels that exist for people to talk, I think must consistently ask the question, what next and what do you bring to the table? If it's just information sharing, you leave people and that's it. But you have to say to people, what do you want to do now? You know, and what is your role in the thing? Because one thing that I've sadly sort of learned is that it's difficult to maintain momentum and energy across 5,000 members all the time, every day. But if you keep asking people the question that, what are you bringing to the table every single day, every single time we meet towards the things that you want to see, it gives a different kind of ownership and agency and commitment and passions to the struggle and to the campaign and to movement. And so I think those are a critical sort of ingredients to the story.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Cito. I think those are being regular conversation, build trust, and what's next. What are you bringing to the table? What's your role? And I think that cultivates ownership and participation. And I guess the authentic objectives of what we're trying to build. I just want to give both Mark and Noncedo an opportunity just to give some concluding remarks, but just to be highlighted in those concluding remarks, picking up of some of the questions that are coming through in the chat. So the one is, what is the importance of targets in terms of progressive change? So you've got, Noncedo, maybe you work really hard to putting in place good norms and standards with timelines, etc. that are then, what is the importance of targets in the advocacy? The second is, what is the importance of coalition building in the work that we do? And then finally, what do you think the state of civil society is in South Africa at the moment, and what's required, what's needed going forward? There were other questions in the group that I think require a whole session on their own, which is like, how do you build the right to nutrition and make that realizable? And the other one was particularly around children with disabilities and their rights in access to the ECD sector. But I think, I mean, unless the panelists want to speak very briefly to those, we might need to set up a whole session to target those questions. But Mark, do you want to go ahead first, and then we'll go over to you.
Thanks, Tess, and thank you for this conversation. And I've been looking at the questions as well. And as you say, there's a lot more, but there's time to have all of these discussions. But thank you for getting this conversation going in the way that you have done today. And I hope that it's been helpful to people, because you know, the process of fighting for rights is is an ongoing daily battle that we can never afford to give up on. So I'm just going, in my concluding comments, I'm only going to touch on the questions that you've specifically asked, and the one question raised by Noncedo a second ago. You know, Noncedo said, can a movement grow too quickly? Yes, it can. You know, TAC, Noncedo, grew very, very rapidly from sort of 2000 through until 2005, 2006. And we made the mistake that the apparatus of TAC grew too quickly. And this may sound odd to people, but it suddenly got too much money. And so because it had too much money, it built an infrastructure that we couldn't sustain in the long term. And when there was money, people started expecting payments, and so volunteerism and activism was impacted negatively. So it's this balance between building a movement that has urgency and power and can meet the needs of the day, which of course needs numbers, but building a movement that is sustainable and equitable. Because if you build a movement too quickly, then also you end up developing inequalities quite often in knowledge between some people who may have been there at the start and other people who don't get the same quality of treatment literacy or ECD literacy that the movement provided at the outset. These are all challenges of building these type of campaigns that we should be talking about. I just want to agree with the person who raised the question about disabilities. You know, we need to be much more conscious of inclusion and of intersectionality in movement building and of the intersectionality within a particular movement, not just between movements or across issues. So, you know, it's shocking, the state of denial of basic education to children with disabilities. It is horrendous, it's horrific, it's violent, it's disgraceful. And the same applies, I would believe, to ECD access for children with disabilities. So you should be thinking about that. And how do you properly build that in? Because there's far more disability than we imagine out there because of the invisibility to everybody who chooses to make it invisible. So yes, you know, there's a whole nother discussion how you do that. Targets, yeah, a campaign must always be clear about its objectives. Very, very clear. I can only speak, you know, I can best speak from HIV, but, you know, we defined our objectives clearly. We wanted AZT to prevent mother-to-child transmission. We won that. We wanted fluconazole, the drug fluconazole, to stop people with opportunistic infections. We won that. We got ARV treatment. We said 200,000 people by 2006. It was a quantifiable thing. Activists could understand the targets. Government could understand the targets. You could campaign around those targets. So that is very important, and you have to empower the people who you're targeting to do the job as well. I think that was part of the question earlier on. Coalitions are crucial. In our TAC days, and I keep talking about TAC because that's where you asked me to draw lessons from. TAC had its greatest power when it included churches and trade unions and scientists and everybody else. And doing that, by the way, again, it takes time and trouble. Sometimes you know, we must have gone to COSATU 20 times to educate their national leadership about HIV. We couldn't go once and then think the job is done. We've ticked the box. COSATU is on board. It took time. You'll have to take time to educate people about ECD, to have the debates. And I won't really say much about this question of the state of civil society because it's a big question. You know, I think civil society has got so much to do to sort itself out in many respects. And in some ways, I think COVID-19 is exposing the weaknesses of civil society. But civil society is an ongoing project, and you can't blame us that we have very profound weaknesses within civil society. We just have to make sure that we are reflective enough that we can see where the weaknesses are, and that we find ways to address them, and that we find ways to share a division of labor so that things that I can do, I do, in order to help things that somebody else is doing, and so on, and vice versa. But that's a short, medium, and long-term political project that maybe you'll have another discussion on another day.
Thanks so much, Mark, for those musings. Noncedo, do you want to go ahead and just, if you can, yeah, 4 minutes, that would be great.
Okay, I want to continue to encourage the ECD sector to build relationships. Build relationships with government is crucial. I think it's a responsibility we have for the moment to help build state capacity. Otherwise, the things that we argue for sort of fall through the cracks. So continue to do that. Build relationships and invite us on board into your campaign. Town hall meetings, public hearings, use local media. We've been doing a door-to-door over the last 2 days, and then era called Khamashashani app, and in every household we went into, there was the radio playing. So keep using those platforms, very localized. The churches, I agree with Mark, super crucial. workers. I think our parents, a nice narrative during this period when people were discussing the reopening of schools was, if we keep our schools open, closed, and the economy is opening up, and to need to go back to work, what happens to our children? What happens to our siblings? And I thought, sure, that connects. We've never thought of like that before, or at least I hadn't. Talk to private sector as well, about that can facilitate conversations with business and where the priorities lie, where they can get their hands dirty, sorry, as well. I think it is going to be crucial. So all in all, what I'm saying is deploy us. We are definitely ready to pick up and run the struggle with you. Equal education, I'm going to share this through Tess, has something called a charter for an equal education. It's meant to be a mobilizing sort of vehicle, tool, feel good expression of the type of education system we want to see. We're sharing it with comrades across the globe, and there are elements of it that speak to our own dreams and aspirations around ECD. And I think it'd be great to use that as a conversation when we next meet. I also think setting targets is important, deeply crucial, because you have to maintain the urgency. There just isn't time, and I don't think, I've always thought it's because we're young, there just isn't time to be passive or second guess anything that we strongly believe in, especially if we're experiencing it at the moment. So we must keep just going and pushing. But whilst in conversation, don't leave anyone behind. All must be mobilized and on board. Two last things is that those broad churches, the coalitions, are so crucial, because that's a space for us to sort of connect the dots and build the type of intersectional movement that's going to take us into a different kind of emancipation or freedom in the future. And that speaks to then the question around SMC. And I think learning with comrades in the Equal Education Law Center has been crucial for members and staff at Equal Education to make those connections. So I think that's definitely something that we need to do more of. And then it also helps us share resources, right? Platforms like this. Spaces, and that's something that I just putting in place hubs.
You just broke up for
filled with stories. Our number on the walls of those hubs as well, because we're the ECD sector. But I just want to say, we're here, the sector is ready, broad churches are important, build hubs in the different regional areas that you're in, you know, put up information and messages around what you're trying to achieve. And we'll tell the story enough times that intersectionally we'll connect the dots and join the struggle as we should. So, Mandla.
Thank you, Sida. I wasn't trying to interrupt you or rush you. You just broke up a little bit there in the middle, but I think you came back, you know, when it does that fast forward thing where all your words flow quickly afterwards. So I hope our audience managed to pick up on all the really incredible advice from both of you. You know, the goal of this webinar today was advocacy and action learnings for the ECD sector, and I think we've really managed to go through many topics today and really get important inputs and advice and guidance from the both of you who really have a tremendous amount of experience. And this, you know, it's an extreme sport doing what we're trying to do. As Sido said, the point is that we want as many people across the country to take this into their own hands. We've got to do a lot of work as an ECD sector that starts from why is ECD, what is ECD, why it's important, and build the capacity across the sector to do what needs to be done. It absolutely is a legitimate cause, which makes our journey into advocacy much easier. And we just have to find the right strategies and build the capacities. Before I move to thanks, I do just want to share my screen one last time. So the real reform, sorry. Is what's on everyone's screen? Is it a yellow poster? Oh, great. Okay. So what we're calling for as part of the Real Reform campaign is for people to show up on Friday in colorful, pick a color, blue, red, or green. The goal is around the bill, but particularly we have news from the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee that the ECD proposed amendments in the bill are going to be rejected due to a lack of consultation from SALGA and DBE. There's a bit of confusion this week about whether it will be all the proposed amendments or only some of the amendments. We also have confirmation through communication to members that the Real Reform campaign being expressly acknowledged in that communication and saying that the ECD sector will still be able to make presentations to Parliament regardless of whether those provisions are going to be rejected or not, which is really, really great news. Because at the time we didn't know whether our submissions were going to be considered. We didn't know whether we would still be able to do our oral hearings. And this technical committee has now been set up by DSD together with SALGA, DBE and Parliament, as well as the State Law Advisor, to determine the way forward with regards to the ECD provisions in the Children's Act. So really some important wins for us as a campaign, but it's still an opportunity. We've still got to see this as an opportunity for change and make sure that the change that we know we need in the sector is implemented. So we're asking everyone to mobilize just at their ECD sites on Friday, pick a color, red, blue, green, make posters that say, recognize me, stop and simplify the standards, or we need your help. Talk about the 5 real reforms, tell Parliament that we want our submissions to be considered, and for our presenters to make oral submissions, and just share that information at ECD Reform and rope in Parliament and DSD. So that's at Parliament and at DSD as well. So that's if we could just call on people just to participate in that very small campaign at your ECD sites on Friday to show really the support for the Real Reform campaign. And then just finally, thank you to everyone who attended today. It really was great, and the engagement for those who asked questions. We hope we managed to answer most of them. I want to thank Ilifa and NECDA for hosting today's webinar, and most importantly to the panelists. Thank you so much for your time, energy, and guidance. We hope, as Sido said, she said, you know, when we meet again. This isn't, this is just the beginning. So we will meet again and continue hopefully to work and learn from each other, work together and learn from each other. And then I just want to end with a quote from Beauty on the chat group, who said, "Together we are strong and impressive." So thanks everyone, and have a lovely afternoon.